A billionaire walked into Lagos traffic wearing rags that smelled of gutters and rot. His hair was matted with dirt, his fingernails were cracked and black, his feet were bare and bleeding. No one recognized him. 3 days earlier, he had signed a contract worth 2.4 billion naira. Now he held a dented cup, begging for coins from people who owned a fraction of what he spent on breakfast. He'd been invisible for 22 days, 528 hours, 31,680 minutes of being looked through, stepped over, cursed at, and ignored. Then on day 23, a woman stopped. Not a wealthy woman, not someone with connections or education or resources, a woman who cleaned toilets in a private hospital for 18,000 naira a month. A woman who had every reason to protect what little she had. She looked at him like he was human. She gave him something that would crack open everything he thought he knew about worth, dignity, and who deserves to be seen. What she did next would expose a truth that terrified him. That he'd spent 42 years building an empire on a foundation of contempt. And one act of kindness from a stranger was about to destroy everything he believed about the poor, about power, about himself. His name was Marcus Okafor, and this was the test that nearly broke him. Before we go further, when was the last time you truly saw someone society told you to ignore? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happens next will change how you see everyone around you. For 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Okafor stood in his private office on the 47th floor of Okafor Industries Tower in Victoria Island. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Lagos like a kingdom he'd conquered. His desk was Italian marble. His chair cost more than a teacher's annual salary. On the wall behind him hung a portrait of his father, Chief Emeka Okafor, whose eyes seemed to judge every decision from beyond the grave. Marcus was 42 years old, unmarried, no children. His net worth exceeded 187 billion naira, built from telecommunications, real estate and banking. He owned properties in London, Dubai and Johannesburg. His car collection included vehicles most Nigerians would never see outside of movies. Yet every morning he woke up tasting ash. His father had taught him one unwavering principle: the poor are lazy. Chief Emeka used to say it at dinner tables, in board meetings, to journalists who asked about corporate social responsibility. If they wanted better lives, they'd work harder. Poverty is a choice, a moral failing. Give them opportunity, they'll squander it. Give them money, they'll drink it. Give them respect, they'll abuse it. Marcus had internalized this gospel so completely that it shaped every business decision, every public statement, every private thought. When his company laid off 3,000 workers to increase profit margins, he'd felt nothing. When street vendors were violently cleared from areas near his developments, he'd called it progress. When his security guards beat a homeless man for sleeping near his office building, Marcus had simply told them to be more discreet next time. But something had shifted recently, a crack in the ice. 6 months ago, his younger cousin, Adaeze, had confronted him at a family gathering. She'd been studying sociology at university, full of ideas that annoyed him. "Uncle Marcus, how can you claim to understand Nigeria when you've never experienced what most Nigerians live with every day? You sit in air-conditioned rooms, making decisions about people whose lives you don't know. You speak about the poor like they're a different species. Have you ever actually spent time with them? Looked them in the face? Listened to their stories?" He'd dismissed her as naive, idealistic, infected by Western liberal nonsense from too much time on social media. But her words had lodged somewhere deep, festering like a splinter he couldn't extract. Then one night, scrolling through news on his tablet, he'd seen a headline: "Foreign journalist spends month living as homeless to expose urban poverty." The article detailed a reporter from London who'd disguised himself to document the invisible crisis in Britain's cities. Marcus had read it twice, then a third time. An idea took shape. Dangerous, uncomfortable, but undeniable. What if he tested his father's theory? What if he stripped away his wealth, his name, his protection, and lived as the poor do? Not for sympathy, not for charity, but to prove definitively what he'd always believed: that poverty was a choice, that with discipline and intelligence anyone could escape it, that the beggars and street hawkers and slum dwellers he saw every day simply lacked what he possessed: drive, character, moral fiber. He'd give himself 30 days, live completely as a beggar, and no money, no connections, no safety net. If he survived and thrived, it would prove his father right. If he struggled, it would mean nothing. Because ultimately, he told himself, he wasn't really like them. He had education, intelligence, breeding. The outcome was predetermined. What he didn't expect was that the test wouldn't prove what he thought about the poor. It would expose what the poor thought about him. Day 1 began at 4 a.m. in a bathroom at Murtala Muhammad International Airport. And Marcus had flown commercial for the first time in 15 years, sitting in economy among people he'd normally never acknowledge. In the bathroom, he transformed. His designer clothes went into a gym bag he'd leave in a paid locker, retrievable only with a key he'd hidden in a location he'd memorized. He pulled on torn trousers, stained and threadbare. A shirt with holes at the armpits that smelled of old sweat he'd purchased from a second-hand market. He hadn't bathed in 2 days, preparing his body for this. He rubbed dirt into his hair, under his fingernails, across his face. He practiced limping, slumping his shoulders, making himself smaller. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Perfect. He left the airport as the sun rose, joining the mass of humanity flowing into Lagos's morning chaos. And for the first time in his life, no one noticed him. Not the security guards, not the taxi drivers shouting for passengers, not the hawkers selling phone cards and bottled water. He was invisible. It felt strangely liberating. Until hour 3, when he realized he was hungry and thirsty and had no way to get food or water without money. He walked to Maryland, where street beggars congregated near the market. He found a spot near a junction and held out a dented cup he'd found in a gutter. Cars rushed past. Pedestrians stepped around him. For 2 hours, not one person stopped. Not one coin dropped into his cup. His legs cramped. His back ached. The sun was merciless, and he had no shade, no water, no relief. By noon, he'd received exactly 3 things. A woman had spat near his feet and called him worthless. A motorcycle taxi had splashed dirty water on him from a puddle. A teenager had thrown an empty plastic bottle at his head, laughing with his friends as they walked away. Total earnings, 0 naira. His throat was raw with thirst, his stomach twisted with hunger. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Okafor felt genuinely afraid. Not of violence, not of business failure, but of insignificance, of being so thoroughly erased that he might as well not exist. This wasn't poverty, this was erasure. This was invisibility so complete it bordered on death. And he had 29 days left. By day 7, Marcus had learned things they don't teach at business school. How to find relatively clean water from public taps before the crowds arrived. How to identify which food vendors might give away scraps at closing time. How to sleep in shifts because sleeping deeply on the street meant waking up robbed or beaten, or not waking up at all. He'd learned that hunger isn't just discomfort. It's a constant noise in your skull that drowns out every other thought. That exhaustion isn't just tiredness. It's a weight that makes every movement feel like dragging your body through mud. That being ignored isn't just rude. It's a violence that slowly convinces you that maybe you really don't matter. Maybe they're right to step over you. Maybe you deserve this. He'd also learned that his father's theory was spectacularly, brutally wrong. It wasn't lack of drive that kept people in poverty. It was mathematics. On day 3, he'd found a day labor job hauling cement bags at a construction site. He'd worked for 11 hours straight in the heat, his body screaming, his hands bleeding. His payment, 800 naira. A meal cost at least 500 naira. Water cost 100 naira. A place to sleep that wasn't the open street cost at least 200 naira. The math didn't work. No matter how hard he worked, the numbers never added up to escape. He was trapped in a system designed to keep him trapped. And he had intelligence, education, the knowledge that in 23 days he could step back into wealth and comfort. The people around him had no such exit. This was their entire existence. The realization should have humbled him. And instead, it made him angrier. Angrier at himself for not seeing it. angrier at the system he'd helped build and benefit from, angrier at his father's voice still echoing in his head, explaining away suffering with smug certainty. By day 14, something in Marcus had fundamentally broken and rearranged itself. He'd stopped thinking of this as an experiment. He'd stopped thinking of himself as separate from the others sleeping rough in Ojuelegba. He was one of them now. When a woman shared her food with him, even though she clearly had barely enough for herself, he cried for the first time since childhood. When a street kid taught him where the police wouldn't harass them at night, he felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. When an old man with cataracts and no legs told him stories to pass the time, treating him with more human warmth than most of his board members ever had, Marcus understood something terrifying. And he'd built an empire on contempt for people who had more grace, more generosity, more fundamental human decency in their poverty than he'd ever shown in his wealth. He'd spent 42 years being wrong about everything that mattered, and he still had 16 days left to sit with that truth. On day 23, Marcus was begging outside Living Faith Hospital in Ikeja. It was mid-afternoon. The heat shimmered off the pavement in waves that made everything look liquid and unstable. He'd been there since 9 a.m. and had collected 237 naira. Enough for a small meal, not enough for food and water and a place to sleep. He'd have to choose. A woman in a faded purple uniform walked out of the hospital entrance. She looked exhausted. Her uniform was clean but worn, clearly washed so many times the color had dulled. She carried a small black handbag and walked with the careful posture of someone whose body hurt from too much work. Most people exiting the hospital walked straight to the car park or the bus stop, never glancing at the beggars lining the hospital walls. This woman walked directly toward him. Marcus's stomach tightened. Sometimes people stopped to curse beggars, to tell them to get jobs, to blame them for choosing poverty. He prepared himself for another assault on his already shredded dignity. But she didn't curse him. She stopped 3 feet away and looked at him. Actually looked. Not through him. Not past him, but directly into his eyes with an expression that made his throat close up. She saw him. After 23 days of being invisible, someone finally saw him as a human being. "Have you eaten today?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, kind, without pity or condescension, just simple, direct concern. Marcus's voice came out rough, damaged from days of breathing dust and smoke and calling out to people who never responded. "No, Amar." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small plastic container. She handed it to him. "I packed extra rice and stew this morning. I don't know why. Maybe I knew I'd meet someone who needed it." Marcus stared at the container. Through the transparent plastic, he could see white rice, a deep red stew, a piece of chicken. His hands trembled as he took it. "Thank you." The words barely made it past the lump in his throat. "God bless you, Ma." She smiled. It transformed her face, chasing away the exhaustion, revealing the person underneath the burden she carried. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then, "Chidi." He gave her the shortened version of his name, the nickname only his mother had used before she died. "I'm Elizabeth," she said. "I clean rooms here at the hospital. The work is hard, but it's honest. Do you have a place to stay?" He shook his head. "I sleep where I can find space, Ma." Her brow furrowed. "That's not safe. Oh, especially not at night." She paused, clearly thinking, then she did something that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. She reached into her purse again and pulled out a bill. 2,000 naira. She pressed it into his hand. "Take this, find a room for tonight. Somewhere you can lock the door and rest properly. You can't keep sleeping on the street. It will kill you eventually." Marcus stared at the money in his palm. 2,000 naira. He knew from 23 days of lived experience and what that represented. For Elizabeth, who cleaned toilets for 18,000 naira monthly, this was more than 10% of her month's income. She'd just given more than 3 days of labor to a complete stranger. A beggar. Someone society told her was worthless, lazy, undeserving. She'd given him part of herself, part of her survival, for nothing in return except the knowledge that he might sleep safely for one night. "Ma," his voice broke completely. "Ma, this is too much. You work too hard for this. Please, I can't take it." Elizabeth closed his fingers around the money. Listen to me, Chidi. We're all God's children. Today I help you. Tomorrow someone else helps me. That's how we survive. That's how we stay human. Keep the money. Use it well. She turned to walk away. Then she stopped and looked back. Come back tomorrow if you want. Same time. If I have extra food, I'll bring it for you. Nobody should be hungry when there's food to share. She walked away before Marcus could respond. He watched her disappear into the crowd flowing toward the bus stop. This woman who'd given him more in 5 minutes than most wealthy people gave in their entire lives. His whole body was shaking, not from hunger or exhaustion or fear, from the devastating realization that he'd just encountered more grace, more generosity, more fundamental human goodness in one hospital cleaner earning 18,000 naira a month than he'd shown in 42 years of accumulating billions. Elizabeth had seen him as human. She'd treated him as equal. She'd shared her resources without judgment or conditions or contempt. And she'd done it naturally, easily, as if kindness to strangers was simply who she was. Marcus sat on the pavement outside that hospital, holding a container of rice and stew and a 2,000 naira bill, and cried so hard he couldn't breathe. People walked past, stepping around him, probably assuming he was drunk or crazy or high on something cheap and dangerous. Let them think what they wanted. How for 23 days he'd learned to be invisible. Now he was invisible for different reasons. Invisible because his grief was too raw, too real, too threatening to the careful lies people told themselves about poverty and worth and who deserved what. He was crying for the 42 years he'd wasted. Every board meeting where he'd approved layoffs without thinking about the families destroyed. Every development project where he'd displaced street vendors without caring where they'd go. Every time he'd stepped over a beggar without seeing them as human. Every conversation where he'd repeated his father's gospel about poverty being a choice, a moral failing, evidence of weakness or laziness or lack of character. He was crying for every person he'd hurt without knowing their names. Every family he'd crushed without seeing their faces. Every life he'd damaged in pursuit of profit and power and the empty validation of being called successful by people who measured success in naira and property and influence. He was crying because Elizabeth had 18,000 naira to her name for an entire month of backbreaking labor, and she'd given him more than 10% of that without hesitation, without judgment, without needing anything in return, except the knowledge that he might sleep safely for one night. While he had 187 billion naira and had never once given anything, without calculating the return, without ensuring his protection, without making certain he maintained control. He was crying because he'd been so spectacularly, brutally wrong about everything that mattered. His father had taught him that the poor were dangerous, that they'd take everything if given the chance, that generosity toward them was foolishness, weakness, an invitation to be exploited. But the truth was exactly opposite. The poor had shown him more generosity in 23 days than the wealthy had shown him in 42 years. They'd shared food when they had barely enough to eat. They'd offered shelter when they had nowhere safe to sleep themselves. They'd treated him with dignity when they received nothing but contempt from the world. The danger wasn't that the poor would take too much. The danger was that they'd expose how little the wealthy gave, how much they hoarded, how easily they forgot their own humanity in pursuit of accumulation and status and the hollow satisfaction of having more than others. Marcus cried until his body ached, until his throat was raw, until he had nothing left inside except exhaustion and shame and something else, something fragile and new and terrifying. Hope. Hope that maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could change. Maybe the next 42 years could look different from the first 42 years. And maybe he could learn to be the kind of person Elizabeth already was naturally, effortlessly, without needing to lose everything first. He opened the container she'd given him. The rice was still warm. The stew smelled like home, like love, like someone caring enough to pack extra in case they met someone who needed it. He ate slowly, tasting every bite, understanding that this wasn't just food. It was communion. It was grace. It was proof that kindness existed even in a world designed to crush it. When he finished, he carefully washed the container in water from a public tap. He'd return it to her tomorrow, clean. With gratitude he couldn't adequately express in words. For now he had 2,000 naira and a full stomach, and something more valuable than both. He had evidence that his father's theory was wrong, that people could be good without calculation, that generosity existed without expectation of return, that human beings could see each other and help each other, and stay human even when everything in the system pushed them toward cruelty and selfishness. Elizabeth had given him that evidence. A hospital cleaner who earned less in a month than he spent on a single dinner had taught him what 42 years of wealth and privilege had never touched. That worth isn't measured in naira. That power means nothing if it doesn't serve others. That the only thing that matters, the only thing that makes life worth living, is the ability to look another human being in the eyes and say, "I see you, you matter, let me help you stand." Everything else was illusion. Everything else was noise. Everything else was the hollow echo of a life wasted on accumulation instead of connection, on power instead of purpose, on protecting wealth instead of sharing humanity. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long on hot pavement. He had 7 more days to complete his test, but he already knew the results. He'd failed his father's test spectacularly, and in failing it, he'd passed a different test entirely. The test of whether he could still learn, whether he could still change, whether he could still become human after spending 42 years being something else, something less, something that looked like success, but felt like death. Now ask yourself this: have you ever given to someone without expecting anything back? And if this story is already hitting different, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What's coming next will shake you. For the next 7 days, Marcus returned to that hospital entrance every afternoon. And every afternoon, Elizabeth appeared with food. Sometimes it was rice and stew, sometimes beans and plantain, sometimes just bread and eggs. But it was always something, always enough, always offered with dignity and warmth. They talked while he ate. She told him about her life. Born in Enugu, moved to Lagos 12 years ago after her husband died in a car accident. 2 children, both in secondary school. She worked 6 days a week, 12-hour shifts, cleaning rooms, washing floors, scrubbing toilets. The hospital provided no benefits, no job security, no respect. But it was work. It was income. It kept her children in school. Marcus, still playing the role of Chidi the beggar, told her a version of truth. That he'd had a good life once. Made mistakes, lost everything. Ended up on the streets. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had lost everything that mattered. He just hadn't realized it until he'd stripped away everything else. Elizabeth never judged him, never asked intrusive questions, never made him feel lesser. She treated him exactly as she'd treat anyone, with basic human respect. On day 28, she brought him something besides food. A shirt, used but clean. Better than the rags he wore. "My late husband's," she explained. "I've been keeping his clothes, but I think he'd be happy knowing someone needed them." Marcus held the shirt, unable to speak. "You should have them, Ma," he finally managed. "For your sons." "My boys have what they need," she said firmly. "You need them more. Take the shirt, Chidi, and here." She pulled out something else, a small card with an address written in careful handwriting. "This is the church I attend. Every Sunday they serve food after service to anyone who comes. No questions. Are no conditions. You'd be welcome there. It's a good place. Safe people." Marcus stared at the card, his vision blurred with tears he couldn't control anymore. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The question he'd been carrying for 7 days finally broke free. "Why do you keep helping me? You don't know me. You work so hard for so little, and you keep giving it away. Why?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but absolutely certain. "Because once I was you. And after my husband died, I had nothing. 2 small children and no money and no future. I slept in an uncompleted building for 3 months. I begged for food. I was invisible just like you are now." She paused. Then a woman stopped. A trader in Balogun Market. She gave me food. Then a job. Then hope. She helped me stand up again when I couldn't stand by myself. And that teaches me a great lesson. Today I help you. Tomorrow you help someone else. That's how we survive. That's how we stay human. Elizabeth looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen poverty and survived it and refused to let it make her cruel. So I'm helping you, Chidi. Because someone helped me. Because we're supposed to help each other. Because you're a human being, and human beings deserve to be seen. It was day 29. Marcus had 1 day left, and he knew with absolute certainty that when he returned to his tower and his wealth and his power, nothing would ever be the same. Because Elizabeth, a hospital cleaner earning 18,000 naira a month, had taught him more about dignity, generosity, and what it means to be human than his entire privileged education had ever touched. She'd given him back something he'd lost without knowing it was gone: his humanity, his soul, his understanding that worth isn't measured in naira or property or power, but in how we treat people when they can offer us absolutely nothing in return. On day 30, Marcus didn't return to the hospital. He had one more thing to do. Dawn broke over Lagos with the usual chaos, traffic already snarling, generators coughing to life, the city's 20 million people waking up to survive another day. Marcus stood in the airport bathroom where this had all begun, staring at his reflection. 30 days had transformed him. He'd lost at least 15 kilograms. His skin was darker from constant sun exposure. His hands were calloused and scarred. His hair had grown wild and matted. But the biggest change wasn't physical, it was in his eyes. They looked different. Older. Haunted. Awake. He cleaned himself carefully, washing away 30 days of street dirt and human indifference. He retrieved his bag from the locker, changed back into clothes that fit his other life. But when he looked in the mirror again, wearing a suit that cost more than most Nigerians earned in 5 years, he felt like a fraud. Like he was putting on a costume. Like the beggar had been more real than the billionaire ever was. He had decisions to make, actions to take. But first, he had to do something that terrified him more than any board meeting or business negotiation ever had. He had to face Elizabeth, not as Chidi the beggar, as Marcus Okafor, the billionaire who'd lied to her face every day for a week. He drove to Living Faith Hospital in his Mercedes. The security guards recognized the car immediately and moved to open the gate. And he parked and walked through the main entrance, moving with the unconscious authority of wealth and power. People noticed him now, made way for him, acknowledged his existence. It made him sick. He found the administration office, asked for the head of janitorial services. Within 10 minutes, he was standing in a cramped office with a tired-looking woman who managed the hospital's cleaning staff. "I need to speak with one of your employees," Marcus said. "Elizabeth." "Oh, she works the day shift." The manager's expression shifted immediately to suspicion. "Is there a problem? Has she done something wrong?" "No," Marcus said quickly. "Nothing wrong. I just need to speak with her. It's personal." The manager studied him, clearly confused about why a man who looked like money itself wanted to talk to a cleaner. But his tone left no room for argument. "I'll send someone to find her." 5 minutes later, the door opened. Elizabeth walked in, still wearing her purple uniform, her expression anxious. She didn't recognize him. Not immediately. Why would she? The man standing in front of her looked nothing like the beggar she'd been feeding for a week. Then their eyes met, and Marcus saw the exact moment she made the connection. Her eyes widened, her hand went to her mouth, her face cycled through confusion, recognition, shock, and finally something that made his chest hurt. Betrayal. "Chidi," she whispered, "why are you dressed like—" "Who are you?" Marcus's throat closed. "My name is Marcus Okafor. I'm the CEO of Okafor Industries. He stopped. Nothing he said could make this right. "You lied to me," Elizabeth said quietly. Her voice shook, but not with fear. With something worse. Disappointment. Hurt. The specific pain of having your kindness weaponized against you. You pretended to be poor. You let me give you food I could barely afford to share. You let me give you money I needed for my children. You took my late husband's shirt. You let me worry about you sleeping on the streets, being beaten, being arrested. And you were lying the whole time." Each word landed like a physical blow. Marcus absorbed them without defense. "Yes," Marcus said. There was no point in deflecting or defending or explaining away what couldn't be explained away. I lied. I manipulated you. I used your kindness to prove a theory. And I was selfish and cruel, and I came here to apologize and to what? Elizabeth's voice had gone hard now, protective walls slamming up the way they do when someone's been hurt by trusting the wrong person. To give me money, to pay me back like this was a transaction, to make yourself feel better about lying to someone stupid enough to trust a stranger, to buy absolution so you can go back to your tower and tell yourself you're one of the good billionaires? No, Marcus said, and though part of him recognized the truth in her accusations. To tell you that you changed my life, that you taught me something I desperately needed to learn and couldn't have learned any other way. And to ask, he had to stop and breathe and force himself to be completely honest, even though honesty meant admitting things that made him hate himself. To ask if you'd let me try to do something I should have done 42 years ago. Let me use my resources to actually help people. Not just you, but people like you, people like I pretended to be. People I've ignored and exploited my entire life. Elizabeth stared at him with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. I don't understand. You have 187 billion naira. You could have helped people any time. Why now? Because I was nice to you. Because one cleaner made you feel bad about yourself. Because you destroyed every assumption I built my life on, Marcus said rawly. My father taught me that the poor were lazy, selfish, and that they'd take everything if given the chance. I believed him for 42 years. I built an empire on that belief. I made decisions that hurt thousands of people because I genuinely thought they deserved their poverty. He paused, forcing himself to look directly at her, even though her gaze made him want to hide. Then I spent 23 days being invisible, being cursed at, spat on, ignored, stepped over, in experiencing what it actually feels like to work 11 hours hauling cement for 800 naira that won't cover one day's food and shelter. Learning that the system is designed to trap people no matter how hard they work, or how intelligent they are, or how much character they have. His voice cracked. And then you stopped. You who had every reason to ignore me like everyone else did. You who earned less in a month than I spent on shoes. You shared your food. You gave me money. You treated me like a human being. You showed me more grace in 1 week than I've shown anyone in 42 years of wealth and privilege. Elizabeth's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in her eyes. So this was an experiment. Poor people were your research subjects. You tested us to see if we'd pass your moral standards. Yes, Marcus admitted, because anything less than complete honesty would be another betrayal. That's exactly what it was at first. A test to prove my father right. To prove that given opportunity, the poor would reveal their moral failings. That poverty was deserved. He took a shaky breath. But you didn't fail the test, Elizabeth. I did. Spectacularly, completely. In ways I'm still processing, you proved that everything I believed was wrong. That the poor aren't selfish. They're the most generous people I've ever met. That poverty isn't a moral failing. It's a mathematical trap designed to benefit people like me. And that the real moral failing is mine. For believing the lies, for benefiting from the system, for spending 42 years being exactly what my father taught me to be. Successful, powerful, wealthy, and completely, utterly bankrupt of basic human decency. No, Marcus said. I mean, yes, it started that way. But it became something else. It became the truth I didn't want to face, that I've wasted my entire life being exactly what my father taught me to be. Successful and empty, powerful and pointless. He took a breath. I can't undo 42 years, but I can change what happens next. I want to establish a foundation, real support for working poor families, healthcare, education, housing, job training, not charity, investment, in people who've been invisible too long. And you want me to believe you, Elizabeth asked, after you lied to my face every day for a week? No, Marcus said honestly. I don't expect you to believe me. And I expect you to watch what I do and judge me by my actions. But I do want you to consider something. He pulled out an envelope. Inside was a contract. I want to hire you, not as a cleaner, as the Foundation's community liaison. You understand the reality of poverty because you've lived it. You understand dignity because you never lost yours even when you had nothing. You understand what people actually need because you've needed it yourself. I need someone who'll call out bullshit when wealthy people think they can solve poverty with photo opportunities and tax write-offs. He placed the envelope on the desk. The salary is 350,000 naira monthly. Full benefits, education support for your children. But more than that, real power to make decisions about who gets help and how. I won't override you. I won't undermine you. And your voice will matter more than mine because you actually know what you're talking about. Elizabeth stared at the envelope like it might explode. Why? Because you were right, Marcus said simply, about everything, about how we survive, about helping each other, about staying human. You taught me that. The least I can do is let you keep teaching it to other people who desperately need to learn. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment. Then she picked up the envelope, opened it, read the contract carefully. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. If I do this, she said slowly, I do it my way. No corruption, no politics, no helping only the people who look good in photographs. We help the people who need it most, even if they're difficult, even if they're messy, even if they don't say thank you. Especially them, Marcus agreed. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Then I'll try. But if you're lying to me again, Mr. Okafor, I'll walk away. And I'll tell everyone what you did. Oh, understand? I understand, Marcus said, and I hope you do exactly that if I fail. I need accountability. I need someone who won't let me forget what I learned in those 30 days. He paused. I need you to help me stay human. For the first time since recognizing him, Elizabeth smiled slightly. You were always human, Chidi. You just forgot. Sometimes we all forget. That's why we need each other to remember. 3 months later, the Okafor Dignity Foundation opened its doors in a renovated building in Yaba. Not a showpiece, a working space designed with input from the people it served. Elizabeth ran it with fierce competence. She hired people who'd experienced poverty themselves. She created programs that addressed real needs instead of theoretical ones. Medical support for families who couldn't afford hospital bills. Microloans for market women who needed capital to expand their businesses. Educational scholarships for children whose parents worked too hard for too little. Housing support for families trapped in slums. Job training programs that led to actual employment. Marcus attended the opening ceremony. He gave a brief speech. Most of it was about Elizabeth and what she'd taught him. He told the truth about his 30 days as a beggar, told it without sugarcoating or self-congratulation, and just the facts of his ignorance and the education he'd received from people he'd previously dismissed as unworthy of his attention. Some people praised him, called him enlightened, progressive, a visionary billionaire who actually cared. He hated those descriptions. He wasn't enlightened. He'd been willfully blind for 42 years and had simply finally opened his eyes. He wasn't progressive. He was trying to repair damage he'd helped create. He wasn't visionary. And he was following the example of a hospital cleaner who'd always understood what he'd failed to learn. Other people criticized him, said it was a publicity stunt, performance activism, billionaire guilt buying indulgences. He accepted those criticisms too. They weren't entirely wrong. Nothing he did would undo 42 years of benefiting from systems that crushed people like Elizabeth. But doing nothing would be worse. At least this was something. At least it was real. At least it put power and resources in the hands of someone who'd use them well. After the ceremony, after the cameras left and the important people departed, Marcus found Elizabeth in her new office. It was modest but functional. A desk, filing cabinets, a wall covered with photos of the families they were supporting. Real people, real faces, real lives improving because someone finally saw them as human. Thank you, Marcus said, for taking a chance on me, for not giving up on me even when I deserved it. Elizabeth looked at him with the same expression she'd worn that first day outside the hospital, seeing him. Really seeing him, not the wealth or the power or the public persona, just the human underneath. We don't give up on people, Mr. Okafor, she said gently. That's the whole point. Today I help you, tomorrow you help someone else. That's how we survive. That's how we stay human. Marcus nodded. He pulled something from his pocket. And the dented cup he'd used for begging, he'd kept it, a reminder of what he'd learned and how easily he could forget. "I'm going to keep this on my desk," he said, "so I never forget what it felt like to be invisible. So I never forget what you taught me." "Good," Elizabeth said. Then she smiled. "But don't spend too much time looking backward, Mr. Okafor. There's too much work to do looking forward." She was right. There was work, endless work. And the foundation couldn't fix systemic inequality or reverse generations of injustice. It couldn't make poverty disappear or transform Nigeria's economy. But it could help individual families stand up, one by one, day by day, with dignity and respect and the understanding that poverty wasn't a moral failing, but a mathematical trap that needed practical solutions, not judgment. Marcus threw himself into that work, not as performance or penance, but as purpose, the thing he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. His father's voice still echoed sometimes, telling him he was being naive, idealistic, foolish, that the poor would take advantage, that he was wasting resources on people who didn't deserve them. But then he'd remember Elizabeth, remember her sharing food she could barely afford to share, remember her giving money that represented days of backbreaking labor, remember her treating a stranger with more grace than most wealthy people showed their own family members. And he'd understand what his father had never learned, that the poor weren't dangerous because they took too much. They were dangerous because they exposed how little the wealthy gave, how much we hoard, how easily we forget that worth isn't measured in naira, but in how we treat people when they can offer us nothing. His 30 days as a beggar had been the hardest, most uncomfortable, and most devastating education of his life. But it had also been the most necessary because it had broken open his carefully constructed worldview and forced him to rebuild it on something more solid than his father's contempt, on Elizabeth's compassion, on the kindness of people who had every reason to be bitter and every excuse to be selfish and somehow remained generous anyway, on the understanding that we're all human, all vulnerable, all dependent on each other's grace, and that the test isn't whether we're wealthy or poor, powerful or weak, successful or struggling. The test is whether we see each other, whether we help each other stand, whether we stay human even when it's hard. Marcus had failed that test for 42 years, but Elizabeth had given him a chance to retake it. And this time, with her help and the help of every person who'd shown him kindness when he'd been invisible, he was determined to pass. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but honestly, and with his eyes open, with his heart broken in all the right ways. That was enough. It had to be. Because the alternative was going back to the tower, to the emptiness, to the carefully constructed walls that protected him from caring. And after 30 days on the streets, 30 days of being invisible, 30 days of learning what it means to be human from people society said were worthless, Marcus Okafor understood something his father never had. The walls don't protect you, and they just make the prison more expensive. The only thing worth having is the ability to look someone in the eyes and say, "I see you. You matter. Let me help you stand." Everything else is just noise, just numbers, just the hollow echo of a life spent protecting yourself from the one thing that makes living worthwhile. Connection, compassion, community, love. Elizabeth had given him that. A hospital cleaner who earned 18,000 naira a month had given a billionaire worth 187 billion naira the only thing he'd ever actually needed. She'd given him back his humanity, and he'd spend the rest of his life grateful that one day, exhausted and generous, she'd stopped and seen a beggar and decided he deserved to be treated like a human being. That moment had changed everything. That moment had saved his life. Not from poverty or danger or physical harm, but from the worst thing, from becoming exactly what his father had been, wealthy and powerful and completely, utterly empty of everything that mattered. Marcus stood in Elizabeth's office, holding the dented begging cup, watching her work through applications from families who needed help, and felt something he hadn't felt in 42 years. Peace. Not the peace of comfort or security or control, but the peace of purpose. The peace of knowing that his life finally meant something beyond accumulation and power, and the peace of being part of something larger than himself. Something true, something human. He'd been wrong about everything. His father had been wrong, the system was wrong, but Elizabeth had been right. Today I help you, tomorrow you help someone else. That's how we survive. That's how we stay human. It was that simple. It was that hard. It was everything. So here's my question for you. Who have you been ignoring? Who have you walked past today without seeing? If this story moved you, don't just watch and forget. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the real test isn't what Marcus learned. It's what you do next. See you on the next one.